Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bob Giles. I'm the curator of the Nieman Foundation. Before I open our program, I wanted to acknowledge the passing this week of a dear friend of the Nieman Foundation, William O. Taylor, who was publisher of the Boston Globe for many years, and who he and his family have been great friends to the Nieman Foundation for a long time. This room is named for Bill Taylor's father, Davis Taylor, who came to the aid of the foundation in the 1960s when some important fundraising was needed. Bill Taylor helped us begin a very significant prize for fairness in journalism, and then was able to raise money when we went through this building project to name this room for his father, Davis Taylor. Well, I'm pleased to welcome you to this forum on journalism in Eastern Europe and our exploration of the question, who controls the media? The idea for the forum was introduced to me several months ago in a conversation with two of our Nieman Fellows, Stefan Candea from Rome, where he helped establish the Romanian Center for Investigative Journalism, and Maxim Trudolyubov, editorial page editor of Vedomosti, a Russian business daily. They said it was time to take a fresh look at the former communist bloc countries and the challenges of improving journalism in their regions. Stefan and Max described this as a region in which the emergence of democracy is progressing in some cases, fragile in others, and non-existent in countries where authoritarian rule remains. Their idea was a timely one that tied nicely into the theme of the spring issue of Nieman Reports, Shattering Barriers to Reveal Corruption. As Stefan explained in an article he wrote for that issue, in every newsroom, censorship and reporters' self-censorship was widespread, and it was aimed squarely at the work of investigative reporters. In the issue of Nieman Reports, several journalists from the Black Sea region and Eastern Europe write about their attempts to report on corruption, the barriers to this kind of reporting, and how they overcome them. We think this is an important contribution to understanding the journalistic challenges in Eastern Europe, and hope you will take a copy of the issue of Nieman Reports with you as a resource. We decided to move ahead to organize this forum with critical support and cooperation from Tim Colton, Morris and Anna Feldberg Professor of Government and Russian Studies and Chair of the Department of Government, from the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, from Grzegorz Ekiert of the Center for European Studies. Carol Osterer, the Nieman Foundation's Associate Director, took the responsibility and superbly organized today's discussion. Carol does not have a role in the program today, but I'd like you to recognize and thank her. We all share the firm belief that free expression is the foundation of democratic societies, and recognize that in the 2 decades since the countries of Eastern Europe broke free of Soviet domination, the democratic experience is uneven, and the freedom of journalists to report freely is at risk. Our goal today is to generate new ideas for the news media and information policies in Eastern Europe and other post-totalitarian states. Specifically, we aim to examine and define principles of best practices for assisting the development of free and independent journalism in emerging democracies, and then consider ways to disseminate this information. We have resource material available for you in the packets, and soon after the conference, we will post video and abstracts of these sessions. We're especially indebted to our panelists and moderators. Some are local, but several have traveled with us to be with us today. We are sorry to report that Sarah Mendelson of USAID is ill and won't be here. I will be introducing the moderators throughout the day. They will be introducing, in turn, their panelists. The first of our 3 panels will explore politics, culture, and Civil Societies in Eastern Europe, a framework for journalism and the news media. The moderator is Joshua Rubenstein, Northeast Regional Director of Amnesty International and an associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Eurasian and Russian Studies. Rubenstein has been professionally involved with human rights and international affairs for 30 years as an activist, scholar, and journalist with particular expertise in Soviet affairs. A longtime associate of Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, he has made many research trips to Moscow and other Russian cities. He has lectured and written widely on the Soviet human rights movement, including a series of lectures in Russian at the Mendelyev Institute in Moscow in the fall of 1990 and the spring of 1991. Please welcome Joshua Rubenstein and the members of his panel.
Good morning, everyone. Here we are more than 2 decades after the collapse of the Berlin Wall to discuss developments in the region of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc, the health of civil society and how that's reflected in the health of the news media. And I can't help but think of another region of the world that's undergoing turmoil today, where we seem to be at perhaps the end of the beginning of this dramatic turn of events that was completely unforeseen, and kind of fantasizing to myself what kind of discussion we'll have in a decade or 2 decades should the events in North Africa and the Middle East lead to some healthy changes and some more democratic societies. And we'll be discussing, well, where's the media in 2 decades? We see the emergence of independent voices throughout the region. We know how the internet and social media have influenced, to one degree or another, the developments, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia. 2 decades ago, we didn't discuss social media. They didn't exist. So I think today's topic is particularly pertinent, not only for a discussion of the fate of journalism and the media in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc, but perhaps priming us with the right questions to ask about the fate of this other region of the world that has also been longing for more democratic institutions and more healthy change. We have 2 very distinguished panel members for this first seminar. I'll introduce Grzegorz Ekiert from Harvard. He'll be using a PowerPoint, so Tim, Colton, and I will not be sitting up here for the initial part of this seminar, and then the 3 of us will be sitting up here subsequently. Thank you. We'll hear from Grzegorz first.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really delighted to be able to take part in this conference. I think it's a much needed reassessment of what happened over the last 20 years, and many things happened in the post-Soviet, post-communist region. I do not specialize in media. I know very little about media, and I tend not to read East European newspapers because I get upset quite often. So especially now when expectations are very different than they used to be. But what I'm going to talk about today is civil society and what happened to civil society in Eastern Europe. Now, it's very easy to be pessimistic about Eastern Europe, and I think we've seen that over and over again. Starting at the beginning of the 20th century. And of course there is a lot of things to be concerned about in Eastern Europe. The recent problems with the efforts of Hungarian government to control media and so many other things really can be a warning signs that things are not all well in the post-communist region. But I'm going to be quite optimistic, at least about some parts of the former Soviet bloc. So the goal I have today is to explore the post-89 transformation and to talk about the diversity of experiences over the last 20 years from the point of view of civil society. Media are important part of civil society. I'm not going to talk about this, but this is going to be more analytical exploration. Now, just to preempt that I may run out of time, so at least you know what kind of arguments I would like to make. The first and the most important issue is the wide diversity of experiences of the former communist countries. So there is no common civil society in Eastern Europe, which is somehow connected to the common communist past. There is this striking diversity of forms and types of civil society which emerged in the region. And in some parts of the region, we have quite remarkable progress and quite remarkably strong civil society in both terms of organization and influence on policy-making process and so on. And then, of course, you know, the explanation of this varied development of civil society sort of takes us to the idea of quality of democracy after '89 and external support among which the EU support for at least some of the countries of the region is very important. You know, the commitments of the states in the region to protect freedom and to support the development of civil society. And there are some sort of, you know, interesting historical legacies which need to be explored. I'm going to move very quickly, and I'm going to show you some data, some slides about the region, just to, you know, illustrate those arguments which you see on the screen now. So we all started 20 years ago with this notion that Eastern Europe faces tremendous disadvantage in terms of democracy building. That the legacy of the communist rule is very unfriendly to democracy, and that those countries will have really difficult time trying to build and consolidate their democratic systems. There were concerns about civil society, which you know, were expressed by many. I will show you a couple of quotations in the moment. But basically, the idea was that the communism destroyed the foundations of pluralist civil society through, you know, decades when the communist regimes were in place. Moreover, the communist system, you know, set up this networks of associations which subverted the real public space. And the argument went that this legacy is especially unfriendly to democracy. Right, so you know all authoritarian systems are unfriendly to democracy, but there was something about communist system which make those communist systems even more unfriendly than other systems. So that was the argument, and you know. Many people make that argument. So, you know, our friend Robert Putnam said that Moscow will look like Palermo rather than you know, any West European capital. You know, Kanjawit was sort of, you know, talking about the demagogues and priests and colonels who will be running those countries. The future will be Latin America, not Western Europe. You know, political economists were sort of, you know, concerned that what we are going to end up will be a low-quality democracy and low-quality economy. So there was a lot of concerns expressed by really experts in the field and people who knew a lot about politics and knew a lot about Eastern Europe. And then, you know, the number crunchers came in, and they discovered that, you know, when you start looking at, you know, to how many organizations people belong in those countries, you pretty much have this kind of distribution. So, you know, the more to the west you move from that line, there is a lot of organizations, a lot of associations, and a lot of people belonging to those associations and organizations. You move, you know, to the right of that line, and suddenly those level of participation are dropping dramatically, and people, you know, don't participate in civic life. Then.
What does light and dark mean? Light means more associations?
Light means more associations, and dark, the membership per capita, right? These are the World Value Survey questions about, asking people to how many organizations do you belong. Right, so there is a paucity of membership in associations in the former Soviet bloc. Now, so there was this consensus emerging at the beginning of the transition that the membership data suggest the uniformly weak civil society across the post-communist world. People looking at participation in demonstrations, for example, showed similar trends, that the participation was declining, pointing to demobilization. Of course, there was lower support for democracy, which was prevalent in this part of Europe. So all these things were reasons for concerns, and they were connected somehow to the problems with post-communist civil society. But the problem with this argument is that when you look at the data, and they suggest that all those countries have exactly the same kind of problem. But if the countries have exactly the same problem, how come that 20 years later we have such an incredible diversity of experiences, both political and economic, in the region? So there is something wrong with this sort of notion of uniform problems with civil society, which are plaguing all the post-communist countries. And indeed, just to give you an illustration how big those differences are, this is the Freedom House Index, sort of our typical measure of democratic consolidations. As you see here, is there a pointer somewhere? No. Okay, so if you look here at the progress of democracy, the countries of Central Europe, which are the new members of the European Union, are doing pretty well here. Then we have sorry, let me take this back. So I'm comparing here Western Europe, Southern Europe, Central Europe, then the Balkans, then the post-Soviet countries, which include Russia and Ukraine and Moldova and Belarus, and then the Central Asian countries, and the communist countries are still remaining: China, North Korea, and Laos, and so on. So when we look at this distribution, we see there are dramatic differences in the quality of democracy between those different regions. And the point to emphasize is that Central Europe and the Baltics really have the quality of democracy in a par with developed Western democracies.
Can I just ask what the difference is between post-Soviet Europe and Central Europe?
Right. So Central Europe are the Baltics, and then the sort of former Habsburg kind of belt of countries: Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia. Right. And then Southern Europe is the remaining part of the Yugoslavia, except for Slovenia, plus Romania and Bulgaria. Then when I talk about post-Soviet Europe,
The Southeast.
So Southern Europe, you meant it's
the Southern Europe, I meant the three democratizers in the 1970s: Spain, Portugal, and Greece. And Southeast Europe is the remaining part of Yugoslavia, plus Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania. And then post-Soviet Europe is Russia and Belarus and Ukraine and Moldova. Okay. Now, different sort of data collected by World Bank about governance show pretty much the same picture, right? We see that there is this striking difference in outcomes of the transition. So, what can we say about civil societies in the broad post-communist space? And the point is that we need really to look beyond the membership data. We really need to look at many different aspects of civil society, and I'm emphasizing 4 of those aspects. I'm emphasizing the quality of public space, the structural organization of civil society, the behavior of civil society actors, and then attitudes and preferences of civil society actors. In the sort of remaining few minutes, I will just give you a couple of illustrations of those differences. I'm comparing those regions which were, on those previous graphs with Western Europe and Southern Europe, right? Because that's sort of, is the best way to sort of, think about progress and lack of progress in the region. So when we look at the quality of public space, it's fundamental for the functioning of civil society and for functioning of media. We can think about this in a number of ways, and here is one possible way of thinking about this. I'm taking the Freedom House two indexes. One is the Freedom of Press Index, and another is the main index of political rights and civil liberties. And I'm sort of, looking at the period of approximately 20 years to see, how the countries, the regions moved, in terms of advancement in those indexes. So as you see, countries of Central Europe made quite significant progress. They moved close to West European standards. There is very little difference between those two regions now. Countries of Southeast Europe, the former Yugoslavia countries, were making a quite interesting progress as well. Not as much as Central Europe, but there is a quite significant progress there. Now, Russia and other countries of the Slavic Eastern Europe registered quite significant regress over the last 20 years. They moved down in quite dramatic way, and of course the Central Asian Caucasus didn't make a move as much as Western Europe didn't make a move during the last 20 years. So that's one way of looking at the quality of public space. Another example would be to look at the Ngo Sustainability Index, which is put together by the USAID, and here the lower number, the better situation, right? So Central Europe and the Baltics are at the very bottom of this graph, and Central Asia and Caucasus are at the top. So I think, in terms of public space, we see quite significant disparity between the former countries of the former communist countries. Now, in terms of organizational infrastructure, right, that's very important for civil society, how many associations you have, how they are organized, and so on. And here we have, quite amazing progress in many places. This is Poland. This is the number of registered NGOs in Poland. And as you see, in the sort of relatively short period of time, we have 10 times more NGOs in Poland than we did have in the 1992. The green line is the number of foundations. So almost from zero, in the very short period of time, we have approximately 10,000 foundations by 2007 in Poland. So that's the picture which is very typical for Central European countries, right? The rapid growth in the number of organizations, and you see this in all those countries of Central Europe. What is more interesting here is comparison again between the regions and Western Europe. This is the number, the international NGOs per million of population. This is an idea of how to measure that. So as you see, there's a lot of international NGOs in Western Europe, but quite a lot of those NGOs showed up in Central Europe as well. And then the numbers go down when we look at the other places of the former Soviet bloc. Two more examples. Do I have one minute? Yeah. Okay, looking at the behavior of civil society actors, again, there is quite interesting diversity in the region. How should we sort of think about this? One way to distinguish is between contention and non-contention. Right? So, civil society sometimes is mobilized for protest and contentious activities, and sometimes is sort of participating in building schools and cleaning the lawns and doing a lot of sort of cooperative kind of things together. So when we look at the contention, this is the old research project I had several years ago. It shows how different countries are even within one sub-region, right? So there's a lot of protest in Poland, very little in Hungary. Those things tend to persist for a long period of time. This is a look at Poland and Hungary for a 20-year period. So, many more protests and longer protests in Poland than in Hungary. So there is a diversity in terms of contentious behavior of civil society actors. But there is also quite amazing diversity in terms of charitable giving and volunteering. From zero in places like Poland, now approximately half of the population is giving money to charity in Poland. I find this to be one of the most remarkable developments in Eastern Europe. And 20% of population participates in different voluntary activities every year. Now, these numbers are higher than for many West European societies, right? So there is something interesting going on in Eastern Europe that people are much more engaged in voluntary activities that they tend to be even in countries of Western Europe.
Does that
And
include religious organizations like the church?
yes, that number includes, right.
Do you know the source of wealth from which these foundations give their money?
The source.
Well, foundations have to have a pile of wealth from which
Right.
it draws to give.
Right.
What's the source?
Well, the foundations, the East European foundations, are small, and they are founded by businesses of different sorts. There's a lot of money coming from local, regional, and national governments for different activities of civil society organizations. And that specific table is about Polish public opinion surveys. Now, East European countries, some of them, at least in Central Europe, have this very innovative arrangement that when you file your tax return, you can designate 1% of your taxes to a specific organization. You can name this organization, and then the government shifts that money to that organization if that organization is so there's a lot of public support for civil society. Briefly about attitudes. Now, just only a couple of examples. When people are asked whether they trust civil society organization, Central Europe is the most trustful place among all those regions we are looking at. Central Europeans like civil society better than even West European, but the trend is up in all the sub-regions of the former Soviet bloc. So we see quite amazing level of trust in NGOs. Couple of other things which should be of interest to us today. This is daily newspaper circulation, and as you see, why the circulation goes down in Western Europe, those numbers tend to go up, especially in the sort of better consolidated, stronger civil society countries of Central Europe. And the last thing is quite remarkable, the interest in politics. I mean, people in post-communist world are much more interested in politics than, at least in those Central European countries, than people in Western Europe. So I think, again, in terms of attitudes here, we have first disparities between sub-regions, but also some very positive signs for at least some parts of the former Soviet bloc. So let me conclude by sort of reinforcing once more those points I made at the very beginning of this presentation. So there is no common civil society for all post-communist countries, and those civil societies tend to be quite strikingly different in different parts of the former Soviet bloc. There is a number of different civil society types which emerge in the region. Some are more contentious, some are less contentious, with different ways of organizations and so on. And the reason for that are sort of deep historical legacies which tend to shape the way in which civil society operates. when we want to figure out how weak or strong those civil society are, this is sort of, tedious point for the political scientist, I guess. We need to look at a wide number of indicators. And then the most important point, the civil society is not in such a bad shape in Eastern Europe, in post-communist world, as we often imagine. Some of those civil societies are very robust and very strong. And of course, the robustness of civil society was shaped by the state policies, by external support, and first of all, by the quality of democracy in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Grzegorz. We'll now hear from Professor Timothy Colton, the chair of the Department of Government at Harvard. His most recent book is a biography of Boris Yeltsin, certainly a transitional figure of some note in the former Soviet Union. Tim.
I'm going to stand up here, if you don't mind. Sure. Then I'll go and sit.
That'll be fine.
Okay. Well, one of the things that is this actually working, this microphone? Yes. Okay. One of the things that journalists have to teach academics is that one of the keys to the craft of being a good journalist is to do everything quickly and short. Academics tend to do things slowly and long, and so I'm going to have to compress some very complex things into some generalizations that you may want to probe, but I'll throw them out anyway in very simple-minded form. I'm going to talk mostly about the post-Soviet 15, and particularly about Russia, although not exclusively about Russia, because just as a starting point, I think if one is thinking about this dozen-plus countries, that one also finds the same spread of outcomes across the 15 that one finds across the 29 or 30 or whatever the latest number is. But Russia, of course, looms very large on the post-Soviet scene. It's now, aside from things like Gazprom, Russian dominance in East Central Europe is now largely a matter of memory, but to the east of that, it's not necessarily so. And so Russia has had a way of setting the agenda for many, although certainly not all, of its immediate neighbors. And the Russian story, as we all know, is not a very encouraging one, because I'll talk here really more about politics than about civil society, but I will turn to civil society at some point. Because essentially what we have is an up and down pattern. From starting point in the late 1980s, when the Soviet model was challenged, and then the Soviet system began to break up, Russia emerges quite unexpectedly from this Soviet bedrock. There's a separate Russian state as of December 25th, 1991, and it seems to have a very hopeful beginning in terms of democracy, although there were doomsayers even then. But the 1990s, the first half of the post-Soviet period, is a period of, one could say, semi-democratic government in Russia. God knows the system was deeply flawed, and it was corrupt, and Yeltsin was often confused, and the strategy was lacking, and it was rocked by all kinds of shocks, including a massive financial crisis in 1998. So it was by no means a cloudless sky. But then, at least this is the way I see the 20 years, there was a transition within the transition, which didn't necessarily have to happen. And that transition within the transition, which more or less coincides with the transfer of authority from Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin, marks the movement of the country onto a very different curve. So to make a long story short, messy semi-democracy in the 1990s, followed by a very distinct authoritarian turn. Now, experts on the subject have some difficulty explaining why this happened. It's not really self-evident why it occurred. Moreover, it's not so easy to categorize the outcome. If you gave me the two words authoritarian and democratic and said which one best describes Russia, then of course I would choose authoritarian. But one probably has to qualify that. I think in terms of describing the system that currently exists, I would begin with state, the role of the state. Statism, I think, is a better one-word descriptor than authoritarianism, although the authoritarian component is undeniable, and of course it is there. I came across just this week a really fascinating interview with a Russian political figure named Pamfilova, Ella Pamfilova. And you can find it easily in the RFE-RL report, May 3rd or 4th, I think it was. And Pamfilova has been on the scene for many years. She was elected to the first USSR Congress of Deputies, Soviet Congress, in 1989. She was an active Democrat in that assembly. She was especially prominent on the issue of privilege, the attack on privilege, which was Yeltsin's thing at the time as well. She then founded her own political party in the 1990s. Was not hugely successful. She ran for president, I think, in 1996. Didn't get so many votes, but she was elected to parliament a couple of times. In fact, I think 3 times. And in 2002, it says here 2002, I actually thought it was 2001, but in the very early in the Putin era, he actually appointed her to head his Presidential Commission on Human Rights, which had been around under Yeltsin but hadn't really been up to much. And so she accepted this appointment despite the fact that she had a very different had very different political values. And she pointed out in the interview that she had actually voted against Putin's the confirmation of Putin in the office of Prime Minister in August 1999. Nonetheless, he did ask her to do this. And the way she describes it, it began actually on a fairly optimistic note, that Putin seemed to think there was room in his emerging regime for an activist Human Rights Council, and that for the first several years, she actually was allowed to do her job and thought she was doing some good. The way she puts it, no one told us what to do, what issues to discuss with the president, or in what forum. Without exception, we all worked on this consultative body as volunteers, so the Kremlin could not use administrative controls. Now, of course, the journalist asks her, so what went wrong? What happened? Well, the way she frames the explanation is quite interesting. In Russia, to a large extent, such things depend on the individual. Everyone who joined the council at my invitation believed in me personally, not in the Kremlin, and I tried not to let my colleagues down. So by extension, she really does personalize the story, and I'm not sure I would push things that far. But her interpretation is that something happened at the level of the leadership to erase essentially this, or come close to erasing, this willingness to allow rights activity and to allow NGOs to flourish. Now, when he tried to pin her down on exactly when this happened, she said, well, it happened over a space of several years. And the years that she focuses on are roughly 2003, 2004, 2005. So 2003, you have the arrest of the oligarch Khodorkovsky, which was on the face of it a criminal matter of criminal justice, but it had many overtones. And then in 2004, the terrible terror incident in Beslan in the North Caucasus, after which, as she puts it, the authorities began to tighten the screws. And then after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which occurs the winter of 2004-2005, Russia adopts a new law on NGOs, which is extremely restrictive. And then the journalist says, at that point was dialogue impossible with the authorities. And she says, formally there was a dialogue, they listened to us, they accepted documents from us and gave responses, but I increasingly have the impression that I was shoveling sand. So that's her account of what happened. In the Russian case, she uses another metaphor. She says they cut off my oxygen at one point. So I was left to fend. They didn't actually fire me or eliminate the organization. They just made it all but impossible to function. Now, then he goes on, just as an afterthought, so did anything change when Medvedev became president? You know, everybody in the Russian political class these days is chirping about Medvedev and his relationship with Putin. And not that surprisingly, she actually says nothing much changed. But she's still slightly puzzled by this because she describes the new president as quite eager, actually, to reinvigorate the organization. She says she had tried to resign. Putin told her to wait until the new president came in. He then said that he was keen to have some of these trends of the past half decade reversed. But she said the pattern was that I would present him with materials, he would agree, give an order, sign an instruction, and everything again would disappear into the sand. So again, the metaphor is shoveling sand. Nothing would happen. And she says this several times. She ends up with a very gloomy characterization of the status quo as far as rights are concerned in Russia. She said she finally resigned, which she did last year in 2010. And when asked why, she said it was simply because I recognized that the system had once and for all turned into a rock-solid insult to all of us. It isn't possible to dress up this insult and go braid in the form of civic initiatives. If you ask me why I decided to quit politics, I respond with a question. Is it possible to quit something that doesn't exist? So that's a pretty black assessment, and some people would quibble with it. I might, if it were me, I might say it's maybe dark gray rather than black, but her characterization of the trend, I find it hard to dispute. So therefore, compared with East Central Europe, and however it's categorized, the countries to the west of the old Soviet border, the Russian story is certainly a much gloomier one, and so these pessimistic prognoses from 1990 and 1991 that Grzegorz was showing us, alas, do bear up fairly well when measured against the Russian experience, at least to date. Now, just a couple of other takeaways, though, from Pamfilova's interview. The way she puts it, and I think she's probably right, this was not inevitable. It wasn't preordained. It happened because some people chose to make it happen and found relatively few obstacles in their way. Russian Democrats still exist. I mean, there are lots of Pamfilovas in Moscow. It's just that they're not very effective. No, people don't listen to them. But it's not that they don't exist. It's that they have made very little headway, even when they seem to have a sympathetic ear at the very top. Another thing that did strike me in light of today's agenda was that she didn't even mention the media. She went through all of the things that Putin had done, emphasizing the restrictions on NGOs, but she didn't specifically mention the fact that the Putinization of the system actually begins, with a couple of things, but in the very first wave, in the first days after his inauguration, clearly he'd been planning it. Putin attacks the non-state media, specifically in the form of the privately owned television network, NTV, which he takes out of commission. It takes a year for it to be taken over by a government-owned holding company, which is actually financed by the Gazprom gas monopoly. So it is odd that she doesn't even mention it. Maybe it's such ancient history by now that she doesn't think it's worth mentioning. There may be some other reason, but in any case, if it were me, I certainly would mention that. Now, let me move on quickly to say a little bit more about the broader region. The Russian pattern is suggestive of a pretty good predictor for these gross trends in quite a few of the other post-Soviet states. Belarus would be probably the one that adheres to it the most closely. In both countries, there was an initial period of liberalization, followed by backsliding under another leader. In Belarus, the initial opening lasts only 3 or 4 years, and Lukashenko was elected in 1994. In Central Asia, as the data that Grzegorz threw up on the board make very clear, it's always pretty well at the bottom end of any chart of this kind. In Russia and Belarus, the initial phase of liberalization was reversed. In Belarus, quickly, and by now more or less completely. In Russia, it took a little bit longer, and it's perhaps less conclusive. In Central Asia, with one significant exception, Kyrgyzstan, there really was barely any initial liberalization to reverse. There was some, of course, but very, very little. And so Central Asia, fits into this pattern as a somewhat, as an almost but not completely uniform bloc. The Caucasus, you can lump that together, the three Caucasus countries, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, with Central Asia for certain purposes. What's different there, I think, is that state building and the process of regime change is enormously affected by war, by one interstate war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, by civil wars in Georgia and Azerbaijan, and by an ongoing state of war, essentially, in this whole sub-region that it has not been relieved to this day. Now, the Baltic countries were quite properly included here with the East Central European states, they long ago shifted categories and are now more or less locked into a democratic outcome by EU membership. It's not that democracy in Estonia and Latvia particularly is perfect. It certainly is not. They have a significant minority problem, but by Russian standards, these are very democratic places, and that seems unlikely to change. If we had year by year, say, Freedom House scores for these individual countries, we would not only notice these sort of aggregate trends, but we would also see a fair amount of fluctuation at the level of the individual country. That applies even to Russia, which, after all, I said goes up and down. And above really a handful of countries show variation from the general pattern and also a lot of fluctuation over time. Georgia is certainly one name that comes to mind. Ukraine would be another. Moldova, right next to Romania, might be another one. And Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia has actually had two overthrows of authoritarian regimes in the last 6 years. And to the surprise of many, it actually has been governing itself in a reasonably democratic fashion since the second overthrow, but it's not clear how long that will last. So we'll have to qualify this by looking at some individual countries that diverge somewhat from the general regional trend, aside from the three Baltic states, of course. To some extent, these are rays of hope. They suggest that, even with this common Soviet heritage and even living in the shadow of Russia, you can actually move in a more democratic direction. But Ukraine's experience suggests that you can move that way if you like, but unless you know what you're doing when you do so, you may find yourself sliding in the other direction, which, alas, has happened in that country. So I don't know how helpful this is. It's awfully general, I realize, but I took this to be the task today. As far as civil society is concerned, here I don't think we have information about civil society in many post-Soviet countries that's as rich and as well developed as would be the case for countries further west. There's been a lot of work on civil society in Russia, actually. Quite a few books, including some new stuff. There's a Russian scholar named Chebenkova, whom I met in Britain last year, who actually tells a rather more hopeful story than most analyses of civil society in Russia. There's a new unpublished PhD dissertation done at LSE by somebody named Samuel Green, which I used in my graduate seminar in Russia this year, which offers also a rather nuanced picture of civil society and its development. Chebenkova, Green, and others are actually, even for Russia, where it's hard to be too encouraged by trends at the level of the state and the political authorities, even for Russia, they actually think that we would make a mistake in believing that civil society in Russia is hopelessly weak and makes absolutely no difference. In fact, Green in particular does some case studies of examples of NGO activity, mass mobilization, where the NGOs actually did make quite a difference. Even numerically, the trend is up. The NGO law of 2006, the Putin law, which was amended under Medvedev, puts them under many restrictions, reporting restrictions essentially. And they're constantly being inspected and monitored and so forth. And that made for a very difficult year or two, 2006, 2007, but actually since that time the number of NGOs in Russia is growing quite steadily. The The Human Rights Watch reports have picked this up as well. On the whole, it may surprise you to hear the government is really not opposed to this trend, except that, with the very important proviso that they're very wary of political NGOs, and especially of foreign-funded political NGOs, which they think do the devil's work, as they did in Ukraine in 2004, for example. So those organizations are still on a very short leash, but others are not. The further you move away from regime change politics, the more congenial the climate seems to be, and the more the government will be inclined to monitor, but otherwise not really interfere. Now, is this good or bad? Depends on what difference you think civil society and social capital make. I mean, in the Robert Putnam School, he argued that for Italy, what really counted most was not political NGOs, but the fact that citizens, Italian citizens, in his famous study of Italy, Making Democracy Work, that Italian citizens belonged to organizations, and in that role they acquired civic skills that then were used in the political realm. So if you're using a Putnam-esque yardstick, then actually the Russian story is not necessarily dark at all, because if this universal model does apply in Russia, it should be slowly changing the attitudes and improving the capabilities of Russian citizens. It is true that the density of associational membership in Russia and most of its neighbors is still quite low by West European standards. But there's even another way to look at this, which is to say that for certain kinds of politics, at least, it may be the association, the group, that matters, rather than the ties that individual members have to that group. And in this regard, again, the trend in Russia is actually in a rather positive direction. As there are more and more NGOs, they are clamoring to have more of a say in decision-making. And that's maybe not completely independent of, but it's analytically distinguishable from the mass membership base and the social capital that those people are acquiring. One also has to mention here that protest potential remains high in the post-Soviet states. I guess it would be an exaggeration to say that in each and every one of these countries there's been a significant phase of protest activity. Probably that was never the case in Turkmenistan, for example. But with the odd exception, in fact, there has been protest activity. It's not been carefully logged and analyzed the way Grzegorz did in his earlier work on East Central Europe. But it's I don't think that's mine. I turned mine off. It's definitely out there. There's a fair amount of it, and there have been moments even recently when it's made quite a significant difference. In Kyrgyzstan, for example, grassroots protest of a rather anarchic sort actually has overthrown not one but two governments in the space of a half-decade. It's sustained civil society activity outside of the protest realm that is probably more problematic. But I think these recent studies of Russia suggest that here the story is maybe more in shades of gray than would be the case if you're talking about the main political institutions themselves, where one tends towards very dark gray, or in the case of our friend Pamfilova, to paint things in really black tones. So that's, I guess, where I would close. Again, just to sum up, for the post-Soviet 15, we do see, again, a range of outcomes. It's not just one thing, and therefore those who said 25 years ago that nothing good would come of the overthrow of communism were certainly wrong about the possibilities. However, one then has to qualify this by saying that in most of the countries of the post-Soviet 15, and certainly in Russia, that the democratic advances of the 1990s have been severely compromised, partly by the incompetence of the Democrats of the 1990s, including Boris Yeltsin, but also by the choices made to move the country in a very different direction after 1999. Russia, though, is not Estonia. Russia is not Ukraine. A lot of these countries are quite significantly, even radically different from the Russian prototype. There are rays of hope out there, and as far as civil society is concerned, there I would find myself, in the somewhat more guardedly optimistic camp. Civil society is not dead in the former Soviet Union, certainly not dead even in Russia, where it's maybe much unloved by many in the government, but they have not tried to crush it. It's not clear that they could, even if they wanted to. They've hedged it and harassed it at times, but there is a certain kind of accommodation, perhaps, that one can observe there, and an upward trend in terms of the number of organizations and their level of activism. So that at least gives us some reason for encouragement. So I will stop at that.
Okay. Thank you, Tim, and Grzegorz, thank you. I'd like to begin our discussion, and please prepare questions or brief comments of your own, but I want to pick up on one point that Tim alluded to, which was the decision, more or less, to transfer control of NTV, the independent TV station that reported honestly and graphically on the first Chechen war in the mid-1990s. And then 5-6 years later, when hostilities broke out again, we didn't have an independent TV station in Moscow. Well, war is never good for human rights and democracy, including in the West. Would you say there was a connection between the fate of NTV and the war in the Caucasus?
Well, there's so many variables that impact the second Chechen war. I guess you'd put the media on the list. I think the attitude of the population towards the insurrection in Chechnya had already changed really by the time Russia initiates the second war. That is, there was a general sense that Yeltsin's acceptance of defeat in 1996-97 had not yielded real peace and accommodation, and that something had to be done about it. So the population was clearly with Putin when the war started. I don't think that was because of the media. In fact, NTV was still independent when the invasion started and Putin's popularity soared. Having said that, though, yes, I'm sure that if Sarah Mendelsohn were here today, she's written about on this particular topic, that the coverage of the war would have been different than it was. This probably applies also to the notable terror incidents in Russia, especially in 2002, the Nordost theater hostage matter, and then the incredible Beslan incident in September 2004, where it was not only the barbarism of the terrorists, but also the incompetence and callousness of government forces that helped produce this unmitigated disaster. And that was, in the end, the truth about that, Maxim could tell us more, Maxim Trudulyuba from Moscow, kind of leaked out, but it was more in spite of the, at least government-controlled media than because of them.
Very good. You've all been very attentive. I think we'd like to hear from you if you have some questions or comments you'd like to share. Where would we, yes, go ahead.
Well,
Maxime.
yeah, it's the first thing that you immediately notice is this divergence between the East, sort of in the East, in what we thought very long ago as a single region. What happened is this distinct divergence between Eastern Europe and let's say Russia and other countries that gravitate towards Russia. What is? I mean, I would really be interested in both Professor Colton's and Professor Ekiert's perspective on what is the biggest determinant. Is it the previous history of these societies? Why are they so different?
We've spent many hours talking about this.
Well, we'll sum it up here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know it's a big, like, I mean, it's like a book, but still, the biggest main points.
Well, I think that, at least there is a very powerful combination, which includes the historical legacies some of those countries had, the previous encounters with democracy, the linkage to West European tradition in journalism, for example, and then European Union. Right, that's the combination. Right, that you were in the Western orbit in quite significant way at a certain point in the recent 100 years, and then you became the credible member of the European Union, or credible candidate for the European Union, and all those benefits, connected with that, with becoming candidate and then becoming the member. Now, these are the successful stories, so I think, that's what explains. Now, let me make one point which sort of relates to this, because, we may see sort of declining differences for one very strange reason, that the autocrats of the modern world learn two things: that they need to have elections, and they need to have civil society. Because, these are the, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, places, authoritarian, didn't care about elections, didn't care about civil society. Now they, all try to do it, right? China is not having yet elections, but building civil society. Other places have elections and building civil society and so on. Now, these are going to be fake elections and fake civil societies, in a sense that you will have, this dramatic shift from advocacy to service. Right? Russia wants to have service NGOs, China wants to have service NGO to do the things state is not able to do, and then to show to everyone, look, we have this robust civil society, they do everything, they take care of old people and children and so on and so on. So that's something to watch, right? It's not about how many you have of those NGOs and how much support they get from the state, but what they really do, right? Whether they are advocacy NGOs, fighting for rights, protecting minorities and so on, or are just simply, the servants of the state doing the state work by other means.
A benign social welfare issue.
Right.
Tim, do you want to add?
Yes, Maxime, when I said that the two of us have talked about this at great length, we teach a course together on post-communist politics, where we look at all 30 countries. And of course, this is a key thing that you try to explain. I don't think there's any consensus around, what has been decisive. But I mean, there's history, there's geography, of course, and those two come together when it comes to the role of the European Union, because when Central Asia is a long way from Vienna or from Brussels, I guess more relevant. And so only if the European Union were to become something completely different would Tajikistan ever be a candidate for membership. Russia, though, in a way could have conceivably have followed this route if its leaders had really wanted to do so. And initially they were, as you know, open-minded about it, although somewhat confused. And then Russia became consumed by its internal difficulties and lost the moment when it might have, conceivably moved in this direction. Mary Zarate, is she still here? There you are, has written about the relevance of the reunification of Germany and the way that the Cold War was ended. Maybe she would want to say a word about that in a minute, which may also be relevant to this question. As far as civil society is concerned, I like this phrase, service NGOs. Russia's done one other thing, which I didn't mention, which is that it is also, under Putin, starting 2005, adopted a kind of corporatist mode of integrating approved NGOs into something called the Общественная Палата, the public chamber, which is a kind of, a pseudo-parliament. It's unelected, it's appointed, and its members are there to represent particular organizations, some of which are probably, phony baloney organizations, but actually some of them seem to be quite credible and I think have quite a bit of respect. And this is, has been the approach in almost every area of the Russian regime over the last 10 years. They want the state to be involved in every aspect of life, even those that were fairly thoroughly privatized after 1990 or so. Pamfilova mentions an interesting detail about her own former job, which is that it was handed over to a man I'm sure you know, I know as well, Mikhail Fedotov, who was one of the 3 authors, by the way, of the USSR law on the press in 1990, which abolished censorship. So, I mean, he is a classic Russian liberal, and he was the main Russian organizer of a conference that Bob Giles, if he's still here, will remember that we organized, and Mr. Taylor also went on that, the man you mentioned, in 2002. So Fedotov has been appointed as Ella's successor. But he also was given the official title of advisor to the president, Sovetnik Prezidenta. And in Pamfilova's opinion, this was a mistake, because she said well, the way she puts it, in my view, having a chairman of this non-governmental body who is a bureaucrat undermines the whole sense of the existence of the council as we created it. We wanted a confrontational, practically oppositionist public structure expressing the opinions of the minority. And instead we got what it's now becoming, she fears, is another bureaucratic structure, because Fedotov, whatever his good intentions, which I'm sure were there, is now required to be, he is now disciplined by the fact that he officially works for the president. So that's, Medvedev, God knows what his motivations were in doing this, they may have been good. But she feels that nothing good will come of it. If you have civil society, it should be separate from the state. That's the whole point. But it's a point that's lost to a large extent on the people who currently control the government of Russia.
Mary, did you want to say a word or two about the East German experience that Tim alluded to?
Sure. Thanks for the shout out. I'm Mary Cerati, I'm a historian, and I've written a book called 1989. And I think why Tim is mentioning it is most scholars of U.S. foreign policy see 1989 as a moment of unadulterated triumph. And in my book, I argue that it's a missed opportunity, that particularly with regard to Russia, that there are in history, when you look at it, there are these brief moments, ordering moments, punctuational moments where dramatic change is possible. And certainly 1989 was one of those moments, as we saw by what was possible in Germany, the unification and so forth. But what my research showed, including in the Gorbachev Foundation, was that Russian attempts at that time to get the then Soviet Union into Western organizations, like not only the European community but also NATO, were completely rebuffed by a triumphalist West, and then that moment passes. And so then I was scribbling notes as fast as I could while you were talking. Then, of course, the EC and the later EU turned out to be such a huge factor, but it's a path-dependent process, and the option of putting Russia or the Soviet Union into it, that moment passed. And then once the dust settles, once the ordering moment or punctuational moment is over, suddenly you have, an irreversible process has taken place, and that has then led to the transition you have now, and the transition within the transition that I would agree very much with Tim was not necessarily, that didn't necessarily have to be the outcome of 1989, 1991. But once the West, for its own reasons, and that's what I describe in my book, closes off the option of joining Western organizations to Russia and the Soviet Union, you have a much darker path set for it.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
I'm just back from 4 months of teaching journalism in Kiev at the National University. I went there without any real background in Ukraine, but listening to the people there grumble about the corruption in government and the horrible distribution of wealth, the way it occurs in Ukraine and so forth, what I was struck by is the absence of any rising, clean, reformist leader. There doesn't seem to be the formation of a serious opposition around any kind of person, sort of their George Washington, or at least a clean figure who's going to take on the government. And I couldn't account for this lack of an opposition or a lack of a leadership of the opposition, and I wonder if you have any insights into why that's the case.
In Ukraine specifically, or throughout the region?
That's where I was, and that's really the only place I have any experience. I was in Belarus for a little while, and I think I understand that situation better. But in Ukraine, there seems to be the opportunity for political action and for opposition, but it doesn't seem to be happening.
Grzegorz, do you have?
Well, that's very interesting question. What you see in the former Soviet bloc and what you see in Africa, I mean in North Africa today, and Middle East, is pretty much the same pattern. That you will get a bottom-up protest, which is organized mostly by younger generations, which somehow is not able to generate any credible leadership which could take over and lead the rebellion farther on, or rebuilding of democratic infrastructure in the country and so on. And that's big puzzle. I think the one possibility which sort of may be close to your heart is that's what is done by social media. That in traditional politics, in traditional oppositional politics, you need years of face-to-face organization building. And through those years of face-to-face organizational buildings, there are people who emerge as leaders, who are trained as leaders, who have all the qualities. Now, today, when you can organize a big demonstration in 5 minutes, sending million tweets, and then suddenly, 100,000 people show up at the, square and say, and now what? Right? So there may be something going on in the way society operates, which encourages, makes easier to mobilize, but makes much more difficult to build the credible opposition movement with experienced leadership.
Yeah, when it comes to Russia, I think it's fairly clear why you don't have effective political opposition in the conventional sense, which is that the system has been designed to make that very difficult. So basically, the electoral rules were rewritten after 2001 to raise the barriers to entry into the political marketplace. And so Russia, which used to have a kind of insane asylum of 250 political parties, something like that, clamoring groups, now has 7 legal political parties. That's it. And it's very, very difficult. I mean, Maxim, I think, wouldn't you agree that if you want to form a political party in Russia today, you need the permission of the government?
Yeah.
There's no other way. They must assent to
I can
it.
even
Yeah.
add, just because very recently I talked to a very sort of now a leader of a growing importance, a blogger named Alexei Navalny, who's become very famous probably for the past few months. And this is exactly what we discussed. And because everyone is saying, why don't you form a party? You would immediately get a huge following, and you are like really popular. And anything that is that you would call a following is there. You just need to. And he says, why would I do this? Because it will immediately ruin everything. Because to go through the regulations, which are they're just impossible. It's a long list. I just won't go into this. But what he's doing anything that you can do without actually becoming a politician per se.
Yeah.
So he's publishing stuff. He's made a website where everyone can contribute facts of corruption, and so that everyone can see that, and then hopefully the authorities would follow up with their own check. But the reality is like this, that we even have an emerging leader. He's probably the closest we have as an emerging political leader, but it's sort of non-political. Because in the sphere of traditional politics, you simply cannot move. There's no room there.
Yeah, you asked about Ukraine, and you know, Ukraine has been, it was one of my ray of hope countries, and you know, by most independent measures, it's still rated much more favorably in democratic terms than Russia is. And there you've had a pattern of alteration in office, which continues. And I mean, part of the problem is I think that former opposition figures or semi-opposition figures like Yushchenko was. He was a former prime minister, so he wasn't an outsider, but still, he was supported by a grassroots movement. Get into office and make a mess of it.
Right.
So he then totally discredits his party, which seemed to be a coming force, is basically wiped out because he didn't know how to govern. Now we have a different pattern, which is that Yushchenko's disgrace and fall from power last year brings to power the person he defeated in 2004, Yanukovych. And Yanukovych has changed the rules of the game somewhat in a Russian direction by starting to manipulate rules. He's even actually gone quite a bit further than the Russians have gone in using the system of justice to punish political opponents or to harass them. So his main electoral opponent last year, many people in the room will know, Tymoshenko, former prime minister, is now under indictment in our terms for, I think it's 4 crimes. Now she hasn't been brought up before a judge yet, but I mean she may very well a year from now be in prison. Well, we could get into whether she's guilty of what she's charged with. That's a whole other matter. But the justice and system of justice and the political system are being brought into very direct contact here. To some extent, it would seem motivated by the Russian precedent. It's not. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Yanukovych has gone nearly as far in manipulating the rules as Putin did, and he may not. It's harder to get away with this in Ukraine, which is a divided society, and where it's very hard to get a majority for anything. But he certainly showed some signs of moving in that direction.
Yes, sir, you had your hand up.
Yes. With the increased availability of social networks, mobile telephones, internet connectivity, and the like, isn't it more difficult for autocrats to try to fake elections or fake civil society initiatives? And related to that, are the autocrats becoming more skilled with the use of soft power, what Joe Nine calls smart power, to sort of manipulate these situations? And secondly, what effect do you think will the increased level of activism in the Middle East and North Africa have on Central and Eastern Europe?
Very complicated questions. Okay, everyone is getting smarter. It's not the situation that the new media, availability of communication makes opposition better and sort of corners the autocrats and make them helpless. No. They learn quickly how to use it. They are incredibly skillful. If you watch China, you see, how they are able to mobilize people for different things, to counter-mobilize, and so on, so on. So everyone is getting smarter, no question about this. Now, I think that still, those in power have many more possibilities and resources to do things than those who are not in power. So that's the point about the new media and technology. I don't. What's going on in the Middle East will have tremendous impact on Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. You see already things happening in different countries, and perhaps it will have impact on some authoritarian places in Asia. I don't see that there will be some repercussions of those events for Eastern Europe. I mean, in big parts in Eastern Europe, the systems are so advanced that you don't need. But I'm not sure whether you will see in Belarus or Ukraine or Moldova any kind of waves coming from it. It's rather other way around. The Middle East activists were trained in Eastern Europe. They were trained in Serbia, they were trained in Ukraine, there were sort of, the networks which were behind the Orange revolutions, colored revolutions before in Eastern Europe were behind. So the diffusion is the other way around, really.
Alex, you want to take some? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Jacques Rupnik from
Oh, Jacques.
in Paris, and now at CES here. Two things about which may make the connection to the media. First of all, I agree with the general picture presented. The number of, I think the thing to stress is not the number of NGOs, it's really what are they doing. I think you alluded to that, who is funding them, what is the room for maneuver. I think that would be and of course that's a very difficult thing to study, because then you can't rely just on Freedom House indexes or things like that. You have to actually look at what is happening in particular countries. But what I wanted to say is that what is crucial for one of the elements that distinguishes successful transitions from not successful is what happens not just to the classical separation of powers between that we have from Montesquieu, but to their relations to two other powers, the security services and the media. This is why this meeting is important. And when we discuss the media, of course, in all of these countries, we have independent newspapers. Under Milosevic, you had independent newspapers. He would always say, people say, you are a dictator, etc. No, look, there's an independent newspaper. How much are they printing? 20,000 copies. Okay. The key question is public media, public broadcasting, radio, television. That is absolutely key. And you will have in all these semi-authoritarian situations, independent press or semi-independent press, which would be simply constricted by, let's say, financial constraints and distribution constraints. Then there would be a third problem, is you have independent newspapers and independent media, but very few countries. I mean, Poland might be an exception, with Gazeta and with more generally the press being of rather good quality, because there is a bigger market, and because there is a tradition that it is the only, to my knowledge, successful case where you have people coming from dissent with the samizdat tradition, and that convert that experience and that social capital, if you want, in the new conditions in the transition. They create Gazeta. Adam Michnik is the editor. Helena Lucivo, the key instigator of the samizdat diffusion, becomes the key person in a new successful business venture that sells 500,000 copies, that is on the stock market, etc., etc. That is a unique, I don't know of any other equivalent case. When I look at other neighboring countries, I see very mediocre newspapers. No investigative reporting doesn't exist, virtually. Very little international coverage, etc., etc.
So that's a good question. Why is it that the new people cannot put together something which is credible, influential, with all the skills, with training at Harvard and other places, right? They're going back to those countries. So that's a big puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, in Russia, somebody mentioned cell phones, internet, social media. These things are all, of course, on the rise. The cell phone use is now essentially universal. That's happened. That's over. The internet is expanding very, very quickly. In a city like Moscow, I mean, it seems to me, in terms of the media environment of Moscow, given the omnipresence of the internet and the general openness of the place, my guess is that the capital of Russia has a sort of climate for opinion which is probably closer to East Central Europe than it is to Central Asia. I mean, Muscovites know a lot about these things. They certainly have access to alternative opinions. I mean, every rumor about Putin and Medvedev, is circulating in Moscow before it's circulating here. There's no shortage of different points of view that they get. However, state television continues to be the bland sort of factual pablum that that everybody gets, and I think that still plays a role, especially at election time, where the key, what you asked about Twitter and manipulating elections. I think that these social media are relevant under conditions when the question is, are the votes being counted fairly? So that would be a close election where one side or the other is cheating. as happened in Ukraine in 2004, for example. But that's typically not how Russian elections are manipulated, although as the ruling party is now clearly losing support, and so it may be that it's going to have to cheat the next time in ways that it didn't have to before. In regional elections in Russia in the last couple of years, there's actually been a lot of quite outrageous falsification, including in the city of Moscow in 2009, that really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. It was just egregious and insulting. So if they get into that realm, then maybe these social media are going to matter a lot more than it was 4 or 5 years ago, when the way that a Russian election was manipulated was not by counting the votes wrong. There was some of that, of course, but it was rather, having a campaign where the only message that voters got, or the main message that they got, was the message of the people in charge. But the closer you get to the ruling party having to fight to keep its majority, then the more these, I think, social media would become relevant.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists, Professor Ekiert, Professor Colton, and thank all of you for your comments and questions. I think it's a good start to our day that we focused on the health of civil society, because you cannot separate the health of civil society from the broader question of how the media is faring. You can't have healthy media in an unhealthy civil society realm. And so we'll see these things advancing and progressing and getting better or more healthy the way each side together can encourage one against the other. So again, I want to thank our panel members and thank our audience. I believe we'll be starting our second panel very shortly.